Thank you very much. I'd like to call the meeting to order and acknowledge that we're in Treaty 1 territory, the home and traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Innu, Cree, and Dakota peoples, and in the national homeland of the Red River Métis. Our drinking water comes from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation in Treaty 3 territory. My name is Lynn Nesbitt, and I'm chairing today's panel. Other members of the panel joining me via Zoom today are Gary Arnell and Kevin Stephenson. Our assessor today is Alyssa A. Darkanova, and our administrative personnel is Zachary Mohan. We will be hearing applications for revision of the assessment roll in accordance with the Municipal Assessment Act. The matters for which revision is requested have been described in each application, and we will limit discussion to those matters. The statements that are made at this hearing are sworn testimony, and anyone speaking to the matters must be sworn in. Be advised that comparisons of assessments of properties are not considered evidence of market value by the Board of Revision. The Board of Revision is appointed annually by Council and is independent of it and the City Administration. It makes its decisions on the basis of the evidence provided at this hearing and issues a written order that will be mailed to all parties as soon as possible. Please note that the Board's decisions with respect to an application may be appealed to the Manitoba Municipal Board if the matter pertains to assessed value or classification, or to the Court of King's Bench if the matter pertains to the application of exemptions from taxation. Should you wish to appeal, information on how to do so will be included with the Board's order. With respect to the hearing process, I'll confirm the points of appeal with your property to be addressed with each applicant following the swearing in. We will then have the assessor's testimony followed by questions that the applicant may have, and then the applicant's testimony followed by questions. Each side will have an opportunity to summarize if they wish. Once all of the evidence about an application has been brought forward, the applicant may leave. The process will repeat for each item on the docket today. The session will close after all the applications have been heard, and the Board will deliberate in private and make its decisions. You will receive the Board's decision by registered mail as soon as possible. As information, all public hearings are live streamed, recorded, and will be part of the public record. We will be hearing items 1 through 9 on our docket today. Mr. Mohan, please affirm the assessor's and applicant's testimony.
Of course, Madam Chair. Madam Assessor, please state your full name.
Oh, we can't hear you.
Alyssa Adarhanova.
Perfect. Do you affirm that the evidence you're about to give at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Mr. Applicant, please state your full name.
Gary O'Frimer.
Do you affirm that the evidence you're about to give at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this is the first hearing I've ever done where everybody's on Zoom today. So that's sort of nice, except for poor Mr. Mohan stuck in the room. Okay, let's start right in on our agenda. File number 1, or item 1, file number 241274. This is an appeal of the assessment value of 172 Edmonton Street. Is that correct, Madame Assessor?
Correct.
Okay, thank you so much. You may begin.
File number is 24-1274. Roll number is 1209-360-4000. The address is 172 Edmonton Street. The owner is Sai Limited. Roll year is 2025 with a reference date of April 1st, 2023. The assessed value is $1,499,000. Classification is residential 2 and the liability is taxable. The property is an apartment and with one building, 4 stories. The actual year built and effective year built is 1931. It has 23 suites and 2 outdoor parking. Follow me to page 2. We can see the request for income information and that there's no subject sale history. Going to page 3, we have our income value summary. So there are 8 bachelor units, 15 one-bedrooms, which totals to the 23 units, and the average monthly rent per unit is $692.37. We can see that we have a gross potential rent at $191,094, a vacancy rate at 4.3%, all of which is model derived, and that the effective gross income is 182,877. The expense rate is at 59 and 3%. The net operating income is 74,925 and the capitalization rate is 5%. This leads to our estimated market value rounded at 1,499,000 and the market value per suite is 65,173 and then 91 cents. Going to page 4, we have our rent comparables so we can see the subject and then the 4 comparables, all of which are apartments. The number of stories ranges from 4 to 3, subject being 4. The effective year built has a range from 1928 to 1939. And we can see that the gross floor area per unit ranges from 565 square feet to 800 square feet. The average monthly rent per unit ranges from subject at 692 and 37 to 783. Going to page 5, we have our capitalization rate evidence. The following is a sample of actual sales that took place during the reference period. The purpose for showing these individual capitalization rates is to illustrate the accuracy of the model and substantiate the model-derived capitalization rates. They are not meant to be comparable specific to the subject property. Net operating income has been developed through stabilizing owner-reported income and expense information. Capitalization rates have been derived by dividing the property's net operating income by its sale price. So here we have a cap rate ranging from 3.46% to 5.74%, and these sales are sorted by date. Going to page 6, some more cap rate evidence. So we can see in the table for the city of Winnipeg column, we have our 20th and 80th percentile, and for the multifamily, we have in our 20th percentile 4.75 and 5.45 for the 80th percentile. Continuing to page 7, we have our Municipal Assessment Act excerpts. Page 8, an aerial image of the subject property. And on the lower half of that page, we can see the location in reference to the surrounding areas. So we can see that there's Canada Life Center downtown. The Forks is on the right. There is Winnipeg Art Gallery on the left, University of Winnipeg on the left. Continuing to page 9, we have some online information for the subject property, just highlighting the good location with a building description, which says these beautiful suites with an old world charm are conveniently located in downtown Winnipeg, ideal for students and working professionals alike. Ladywood is just a short walk away from the University of Winnipeg in one direction and True North Square in the other. Ladywood is also surrounded by ample entertainment options, including Convention Center, Manitoba Art Gallery, Portage Place Mall, Canada Life Center, major bus routes, grocery stores, and pharmacies, and all close by. So online they say that it has a perfect walk score of 100, and then there's the image of the exterior and the interior, which seems to be renovated from 1931. Continuing to page 10, 3 more images showing the kitchen on the top, bedroom, bathroom. And then going to page 11, we have the mailer for 2022. in the beginning, continuing to page 12, we can notice that there is a 21% vacancy in this year. And in page 13, just going to the financials, we can notice that for the HVAC here, there is the year to date saying 122,515, which is substantially higher than the 2020 mailer, which I have in previous pages, but we can see on page 14 that the NOI here is a negative figure by 88 grand. Continuing to page 15 is the beginning of the mailer for the year 2020, which in my opinion is more realistic for what this apartment could typically expect on a more typical basis, I guess, without the high expense or vacancy. And we can see that here there's a 2.3% vacancy reported, and then that the HVAC in the page 17 has a figure of 4,373. And here on page 18, to note would be that the reported net operating income is $73,872.85, which in my opinion is in line with what we have in our model assessment here today. Net operating income for model, if we go back to page 3, is at 74 grand $925. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I'm open for questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Reimer, questions for the assessor?
Thanks, Madam Chair. And could I ask, there's going to be some questions that are common to all the files, primarily relating to cap rates. So could I ask that the questions asked and answered in this hearing be carried forward to the remainder of the hearings as well?
Of course, thank you.
Thank you. So, Ms. Darkanova, could we very quickly on your page 1, just to confirm that the actual year built and the effective year built for the subject are 1931, correct?
Correct. We do not have an effective year in place.
Okay. And briefly, and you referred to this then briefly on your page 3, and I believe you mentioned these are entirely model-driven values right from gross
Correct.
potential down through cap rate, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Could we turn to your page 5, please? So the capitalization rate, can we agree that the capitalization rate derivations, well, I'll take a half step back. The capitalization rate is, in theory, a function of a stabilized net operating income and the sale price, and the ratio between the stabilized NOI and the sale price is what in theory produces the cap rate, correct?
Correct.
And the department's provided you with this chart on page 5. We could agree that there's, depending on the stabilization that's applied both as to the rental revenue and the expenses, that could impact the capitalization rate that would be indicated by a particular sale price. Would you agree with that?
Would you be able to, I guess, reiterate that?
Absolutely. So if one makes, in a capitalization rate as mentioned, the indicated cap rate is a function of the stabilized NOI divided by sale price. So with the stabilized NOI, which in turn is based presumably on some of the indicators for the property, both the revenue and expenses, and if one makes different assumptions about either the revenue or the expenses or both, that could impact the NOI, which would then impact the indicated capitalization rate.
That is true, but I know that for these sales, our assessors have thoroughly verified them and that they've used property addresses and sales that I guess passed their standards for making sure that they were verified.
I mean, fair comment, Mr. Darkanova, but you'll appreciate what the department has not provided you with respect to this chart. There's nothing in your submission that indicates how the NOI was generated and therefore how the capitalization rates that are on this chart were actually produced. Is that correct?
Well, on the lower half of the, I guess the second paragraph before the table, it says that the net operating income has been developed through stabilizing owner-reported income and expense information, and then dividing that by the property's net operating income by its sale price.
Absolutely. Mathematically, I understand, Ms. Darkanova, but that's not the question. The question that I posed was the department's provided you, and this is, no doubt this is helpful information to the extent that it's there. But what the department hasn't provided you is the full stabilization to indicate how the NOI was arrived at, correct?
Correct.
And with respect to just very briefly going to your next page 6. So I noticed with the multifamily chart, and this is again another summary chart, the 20th percentile being at the very low end of the range is 4.75. And if the one then looks at the capitalization rates on page 5, the majority of, or significant number, I should say, of these transactions and the indicated cap rates are actually considerably below the 20th percentile, correct? I count a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the capitalization rates are below the 20th percentile.
Yeah, that would be correct.
Okay.
But I guess
With
that being said, seems that it's just an occurrence with, I guess, the sales that we did have at our disposal to use.
Okay. Were you aware, now our seems like a trade question, but make sure we can agree, our reference date for this assessment and all of these matters is April 1st, 2023?
Correct.
And were you aware of the alternate investments, specifically the guaranteed investment certificates or GICs, that rate was, as of the reference date, was at 4.5%?
I'm not too familiar.
Fair enough. With respect to 677 Maryland, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the sixth property on the chart on your page 5. Were you aware that that property transacted? There was, of course, the 2020 sale, but were you aware that that property also transacted in March of 2023, just a month before the reference date?
I'll take your word for it.
And sorry, Madam Chair, if I might have a minute, I think that some of these points that I'm going to make would come out through rebuttal, so I'm not sure it would be fair to ask some of these questions of Mr. Darkanova. If I could have a moment, please.
Mhm.
The only question, and again, Mr. Darkanova, if you're not entirely familiar with it, that's fine. But are you aware of the municipal board, a municipal board order that speaks to properties that are purchased with the intent to renovate, and the board's findings that where it's demonstrated that that is in fact one of the motivations, that those shouldn't be used for capitalization rate derivations? Are you familiar with that order?
I'm not too familiar, sorry.
Fair enough. Madam Chair, those are my questions. And again, if I might ask that those be carried forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reimer. Mr. Arnell, questions for the assessor?
No, I don't have any questions, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Stephenson, you're all of a sudden mute. Yeah, okay, there you are. Do you have
No
questions for the
questions, thank you.
assessor?
I clicked the wrong button. No questions, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Assessor, have you inspected this property?
I have not.
Okay, has it been inspected recently by anyone?
Let me see if I can figure that out quickly. I wouldn't be too familiar with that.
Okay.
Don't
Um,
have an answer.
Okay. I did note that, the pictures, they're pretty nice. And as you pointed out, doesn't really reflect a 1931 building, but that wouldn't, or would that factor into your cap rate at all? Or is it just the straight age, location?
I think it would factor into the cap rate as the property wouldn't be seen as such high of a risk if it's renovated to an extent that the effective age requires an adjustment.
How would you know if it's not been inspected?
Oh, just assuming based off these online images that it does not seem to reflect 1930. It would have to be inspected before such an adjustment would have to be made.
Okay. Um, so it hasn't been inspected for, like, formally, you don't, or do you look at these online images of the properties in your portfolio and make adjustments within your system as to quality and updatedness and that sort of thing without an inspection?
No, I think we would usually require an inspection, and we do have the effective year as 1931.
Okay,
So the cap rate is taking that into consideration. It's not
okay,
capturing what seems to be a renovated apartment.
okay. That's sort of what I was trying to get at. Maybe not in a very good way, but it's not capturing that improved building, right? Or
No.
what looks like an improved building. I see it's still got radiators and that sort of thing. So obviously
Hmm.
there's some older features, but it looks pretty updated from the pictures, and certainly the advertisements for it are highlighting positive things. Okay.
Yes.
You've gone through the mailers, so I appreciate that. I have no other questions. Mr. Reimer.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So I do have rebuttal, and then again, I just ask that if I might just present it once
Okay.
and have any questions from Mr. Darkanova and yourselves and have that carried forward. But
Okay,
before
but before we get into your rebuttal,
Yeah.
we need to do your main evidence first.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So one thing I'd like to point out, and it gets exactly, Madam Chair, to the question you just had. Very briefly, could we just turn to the assessor's page 5? Because I did find it interesting in terms of the same thing occurred to me, Madam Chair, as far as the effective and variant age. And I'd just like to point out on page 5, if you look at the transaction for 677 Maryland, and that is subject to some further comments in the rebuttal relating to a more recent sale, but that's a building that was originally built in 1913 with a variant age of 1972. Obviously, substantial work done on that property. And with the assessor's own evidence on the transaction from 2020, the capitalization rate is basically 5.6%. So I'd ask the board to bear that in mind. This is, and because Madam Chair, your questions and your point is very well received, but it certainly suggests that even just looking at that in isolation would tend to indicate that the 5% applied by the model seems very low. So if I could ask the board members and Mr. Darkanova then to turn to our submission. And I'm going to, in order to keep things moving at a reasonable pace, Madam Chair, there's several cases on the docket today where, quite bluntly, NOI is not an issue, and this is one of them. Our NOI is, in fact, a little bit higher than what the department's applied, so hence there was no questions on the model-driven PGI or EGI or expenses, because there's no point. We're actually a tick above it. So could I ask the board members to turn to page 16, please? So as you can see on page 16, this is our valuation for the subject. And if you look at line number 33, you can see that our NOI is actually about $5,000 to $4,500, I guess, different and higher than what the department supplied. So again, NOI is not at issue at all. It's all comes down to cap rate. So focusing on that then for a few minutes. So the capitalization rate that I'm suggesting for the subject is 6.10% as opposed to the department's 5.0%. So give some background now. If you turn back 2 pages to page 14. So on page 14, towards the top of the page, there's a small chart, and the capitalization rates that we are applying for buildings built prior to 1946 is between 6.1 and 6.6%. And I have applied a rate at the very lowest end of that range, in this case at 6.1%. And we do note that the property obviously is an older age. And certainly part, Madam Chair, of what I looked at when looking at that range was the condition of the property, and making the assumption, notwithstanding the department's has not applied a variant age. I am using something that would reflect at the lower end of the scale, reflect the the condition of the building, and hence the 6.1 request in this particular case. So with that said, what I'd like to now do, and again, I propose to do this once, please, if I could. If I could ask the board members and Mr. Darkanova to turn to our capitalization rate study. Madam Chair, let me know when you get there.
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Reimer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Page 4, please, initially. A couple of things, and it's going to arise at the hearings this afternoon. I wanted to briefly run through some of the references we make from the appraisal text as it relates to the entire purpose of the exercise when we're valuing these things. And it's the first 3 paragraphs, and what those paragraphs get to is essentially the principle of anticipation. In point number 1, the basis of income producing real estate is the future income it will produce. Historical data on a property is relevant only insofar as it helps interpret current market conditions. So while certainly you make reference to what has been happening with the property, the key component, and this does arise in the context of some of our own cap rates, is what the expectation would be on a go forward with the future income. Paragraph number 2, that's the very principle of anticipation I'm talking about. And then paragraph number 3, it says historical income and current income are significant, but the ultimate concern is the future, and the expected pattern of income stream changes are critical. So in that context, I'm asking the board to then take a look at our capitalization rate information, the summary on page 12, please. So on page 12, there's a total of 6 transactions that we have applied in our study. They range from a low of 5.26% up to a high of 7.11%. The 7.11% is actually 677 Maryland, which is the question I had of Mr. Darkanova earlier concerning the more recent transaction. As you can see there's a variety of building sizes and suite counts, and certainly based on the analysis that we've done, and if there is a significant volume of information in the capitalization rate study to show how we derived the NOI, to show how we ultimately calculated the cap rates. But certainly within the context of that data and the information of the subject as far as the calculation of the NOI, which isn't under dispute, I do believe that the 6.1% for this particular asset is appropriate. A question I've got, Madam Chair, for the board members and Mr. Darkanova. I can go into as much or as little detail as is appropriate as far as how the specific information, how the rates were derived. What I will tell you, perhaps I'd go through pages 13 through 21 very briefly, and then to the extent that questions arise or if further information is desired, because I don't know how the level of familiarity of the board members with the study, I'm happy to go into a lot of detail, but bearing in mind keeping it to a reasonable timeline, then I'd propose to go that way. So page 13, this is our calculation of the capitalization rate for 345 Talbot. As you can see there, what we've applied is actually the average rent from the sale brochure. And again, this is getting to the point of anticipation and what the future expectation of the revenue would be. So we've applied a potential market gross rent of $266,112, which is 924 suite, again, taken from the sales brochure. We've applied a market vacancy allowance of 1.4. The expenses as shown, total 132,248. They're less than the actuals, but that's because there seemed to be a very high expense for security intercom, and so we've defaulted to the 2020 statement and used an expense of 5,400 for that particular item. Then moving to page 15. This is our capitalization rate, and this, Madam Chair, relates to the more recent sale. It's a March 2023 sale for 677 Maryland. We do note, and you'll see in the comments on the bottom of that page, that there has been actually a consistent decline in the sale prices for the property. There's been 3 transactions in the past, well, in the 9-year period leading up to the reference date. In 2014, it sold for 2.6. In 2020, it sold for 2.4. And in 2023, in March of 2023, it actually sold for $2,176,000. So this is a property whose value has been demonstrably declining over that period of time based on the sale prices. So in that case, as you can see there, we're applying total potential, effective gross income of $296,477. We have again used, in terms of the potential rent, we've used what was showing as the average rent from the November 2022 rent roll. That November rent roll would have been the frame of reference closest to the sale date, which was in March of 23. So we've applied that average rent and the expenses shown there of $141,834, and the indicated cap rate is 7.11%. Then turning briefly to page 17, this is our capitalization rate derivation for 738 St. Mary's Road. Again, we're using the information from the brochure that we had on file. Average rent is $778. Expenses as shown there are $48,928, and an indicated cap of 5.26% for this property. Turning briefly then to page 19. This is a newer building built in 2017 at 100 Maryland. We've applied here because we didn't have the specific data for the property. What we've done in order to attempt a cap rate derivation is to use some CMHC statistics for newer properties. Results in a potential rent of $1,448 a suite, $191,000. The expense ratio that we've assumed in this case is 40%, which is typical for the newer apartments, which range from 35 to 42, and the indicated cap rate is 5.44%. On the following page for 150 Hendon, again, you can see there that the cap rate we're deriving is 5.42%. This gets to, Madam Chair, my point earlier about the principle of anticipation, the expectation of the future revenue stream. The transaction occurred in June of 2021. There are residential tenancies branch RTB orders that are effective June 1st. And the result of those orders is to have a significant increase in the rental rates. And given the time now, the date of the RTB orders was July 14th. So roughly a month and a half after the possession date. But I'd suggest you certainly, a sophisticated investor is going to be very cognizant of the process in the RTB and would be certainly seeking the advice of the vendors to the expectation of those results of those orders. And we have applied, based on the, again, principle of anticipation, we've applied the potential rent of 712, call it, yeah, 712,182. Taking those matters into account, we've applied expenses of 348,000, and the indicated cap is 5.42%. Next page is 2390 McPhillips. Again, this is similar in terms of the application of the principle of anticipation. The actual rents in this was a transaction in October of 2020. The actual reported rents in 2019 were, as you can see at the top of that page, $1,445,095. We believe quite firmly that those were below market, and that certainly an investor would be taking into account that fact and adjusting the potential income stream to something that much more closely approximated market. So we've applied a potential gross rent of $1,649,000, market vacancy of 3.47%, notwithstanding that the actual was lower. And expenses, as you can see, there are 552,737. So the indicated cap rate is 5.59% for that particular property. So again, happy to go through what lies behind all of that is significant volumes of information as to how those summaries were prepared. Happy to go through that to the extent that it's required or desired. But what I would ask is that the board consider those capitalization rate indicators, and in that context, our request for a 6.1% capitalization rate in this case. Madam Chair, could I again, for the purpose of this hearing and with the request that it be carried forward, could I ask the Secretary to submit the rebuttal to the city's capitalization rate information at this time, please?
Okay, Mr. Reimer, we still will need to have questions asked of you
First,
on your
okay,
main presentation, and then we'll
Fair
get
enough.
to the rebuttal. So have you concluded with your main presentation?
yes, I have indeed, yep.
Okay, thank you very much. Ms. Assessor, questions for Mr. Reimer?
No questions, thanks.
Thank you.
But I also have a rebuttal, just putting that
Oh.
out there.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Stephenson, questions for Mr. Reimer?
Are you putting a heavy reliance on the comparison of the one property at 677 Maryland, like for cap rate? You keep referring to it. I just want to confirm that that's.
Well, so 677 Maryland, Madam Chair, the reason I referred to that specifically for this property, the quick answer would be no, not for all the properties on the docket, but the interesting sort of corollary to this property is the older original age, which is 1913, and a significant increase in the effective age to 1972. So obviously very substantial renovations. I'd suggest that that's probably at the extreme end in terms of the work that's been done. But in our capitalization rate study, and I'll just go back to it, I referred to the more recent sale in March of 23, and that's on our page 64 of our cap rate study. Our cap rate is 7.1%. So in answer to the question, Madam Chair, I'm not suggesting 7.1%. In this case, I'm using 6.1, but certainly it's, to the extent it's an older building with obviously substantial renovations, I'd suggest even more so than the subject. I believe the 6.1% request is justified. Thank you.
Would you feel that area is a little substandard to the subject property here too, like at 677 versus 172?
The quick answer would be that's very possible, and that would explain the spread between 7.1 and 6.1 possibly. That's a fair comment.
No further questions, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Arnell?
Just one on the cap rate study, like, is there a final sheet where you have the comparables all in one sheet showing the cap study?
Page 12. Try page 12 of the study.
No, maybe I skipped over it.
If Madam Chair, if a summary is what, and maybe I'm understanding it wrong, but that would provide the summary.
No, okay.
Yep.
Yeah, okay, thank you. That's what I was looking for.
Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Reimer, have you been in this property?
And I can say that right up front. I have not inspected the properties on the docket today.
Okay, thank you. Okay. And how many, probably asked this many times before, but how many apartments are in your cap rate study?
A total of 6 transactions in our study.
Okay. So on the basis of that 6, that's what you're deriving your cap rates on?
It's providing the indicated range, and yes, that forms the basis of our conclusions on that summary chart on, let me get the right page reference.
No, on page 12.
12.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
How did you select these particular?
Well, so for this particular one, Madam Chair, I'm looking back to, actually it's in the main brief, I think.
Like in your cap rate study I'm referring to.
Right.
How did you, yeah.
Well, so in our evidence in chief, Madam Chair, the indicated range, well, that's what doesn't show in the cap rate study, unfortunately. It's my evidence in chief, but there's a chart on page 14 that has the pre-1946 as the bracket, starting with a rate of 6.1 to 6.6, and I've applied the 6.1 at the low end of that range for the reasons we talked about. So that's effectively where I'm getting it from, notwithstanding that, notwithstanding the 7.11% on the Maryland, which I'd suggest perhaps the subjects would need to have an adjustment for location possibly, but certainly the 6.1 request versus the 7.1 indicated rate, I believe that's justified.
Okay, and how did Altus pick the 6 apartments that are in your cap rate study that are used to develop this range?
Yeah, I believe, Madam Chair, that the properties that were chosen were based on where either we had enough information or we were able to glean enough information, like the in a couple of cases the sales brochure and such, where we could pick specific information out of it, or in the case of the one property where we're using CMHC values, that seemed pretty clear. So that it was on the basis of information that either we had or we could reasonably infer from the market.
Okay. And how many apartments do you think transact in the city of Winnipeg every year?
Actually,
I know that might be completely an unfair question. I get that, but just
it's not. It's a question. So let's go. Let me find it. I believe I'm going to be going. Okay, so if you could go now back to the cap rate study.
Yeah.
And now flip basically right to the end, and then work a few pages back.
Okay.
So there are some, it starts at page 121 and continues through page 125. These are the transactions that we pulled from real estate board information that we had. And it actually has, it's not just for 2023 or even 2022. These are a range of properties starting in 2021 up to the reference date. So you can see, starting on page 121 with the pre-1946, there's about a dozen transactions there or so from 1946 to 69, and that's on pages 122 to 123. There's a number of transactions. Looking at then at page 124, there's a total of 6 transactions for the bracket 1970 to 89. And then finally on page 125, there's 2. Obviously, there's not many transactions for the newest properties. So to answer the question, those would be the number of transactions in 21, 22, and the first part of 23 that we are able to source through the real estate board.
So out of these, then you selected 6.
We have, based on the data we either had or could infer. Yep.
Would you have had data on more than 6 and just chose the 6?
That I'm not in a position to answer. I'd like to, quick answer would be I didn't prepare the capitalization rate study, but the information, as I understand it, is if we didn't have anything to go on, we wouldn't start trying to drive something if we didn't know the suite count or the suite mix or things like that. Okay. So the quick answer is I'm not sure, but I'd like to think that we selected it based on the availability of data versus some other criteria.
Okay. Okay, thank you for that, Mr. Reimer. Now, just give us a minute and we will receive your rebuttal evidence. So, Mr. Mohan, I don't know if you have sent it or sending it.
I believe it should be uploaded to the SharePoint. Should just need a refresh.
Yeah.
Who's being heard first? Sorry, for the rebuttal.
Altus will go first.
Okay.
And I have it. Do other members of the panel have it?
I don't have it yet.
Okay, did you refresh your drive? It is there under, it's before item 1.
I'll refresh again.
And you'll see actually the assessor's rebuttal 2 above that.
Yeah, got him.
Okay. Mr. Stephenson, do you have it? Okay, and Mr. Reimer? Okay, you can, Ms. Assessor, do you have the rebuttal?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead then, Mr. Reimer.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So on the rebuttal then that we just submitted, if I could turn briefly to page 2. Recall my question of Ms. Adarkanova concerning the GIC rates and the significant increases in the interest rates and accordingly the GIC rates. So as of the reference date, the interest or the GIC rate was 4.5%, and certainly logically, I'd suggest that when you're looking at the department's filed some capitalization rates well below that, and I'd certainly suggest that when you start talking about rates that are, fully 100 basis points or even more, 125 basis points below a GIC, which is carries with it virtually no risk, that seems a little odd as of the reference date. Now, again, timing is everything. So to the extent that if there's a 2020 transaction or even 21, it took time for rates to climb the way they did, but certainly by April of 23, having reached the heights that those the increases did, that would be a factor as of the reference date and the impact on the cap rates. So then turning briefly to page 4, there's a few comments we had. The comment that I just mentioned with the GIC rates, that would apply to 727 Sargent and 241 Young, which seem very, very low relative to even the virtually no risk GIC investment. 459 Sargent, in that case, the average monthly rent of, according to the MLS listing, was $740 per month, and also then adding $40 per stall for 5 stalls. We're suggesting that the purchaser would be using, again, that prospect based on the principle of anticipation. They'd be looking at that monthly rent of $740 that was provided in the MLS listing. And Madam Chair, I'd just comment that, and I'm sure the board members and Ms. Adarkanova would appreciate this, but the real estate agents in these brochures, obviously they're going to be trying to sell the property. They're going to be trying to put the property in a positive light, and that's all well and good. What they can't do, though, both under ethical responsibilities and legal responsibilities, they can't misrepresent the anything relating to the performance of the property or the status of the rents and such. So to the extent that the real estate agent is quoting or the MLS listing is quoting $740 a month, that number would have been chosen very deliberately and with the knowledge that that's a number that certainly couldn't be misrepresented and a number that the purchasers could rely on. So then if you go to page 5, you can see there are workup for 459 Sargent based on the $740 rent for the apartments. The expenses shown there, $57,887, and that results in an indicated cap of 5.79% as contrasted with the department's rate of 4.8%. And the following page is the MLS listing that I referred to, and in the public remarks, as you can see roughly in the middle of the page, it says average rent approximately $740 a month. It also shows towards the bottom on the left-hand side a very brief income statement of anticipated rents and NOI. The gross income shown is $101,142. Turning then to page 7, 150 Hendon is a property that both the department and ourselves have used in our cap rate study, and we're coming to different conclusions. The department hasn't provided the stabilization, but what we did note in this submission, and as I noted previously, the vendor had done some renovations that applied to the RTB. The RTB ultimately approved the vendor's application with only a slight change. The request had been an increase of 8.34% to the rent. Ultimately, the RTB approved an increase of 8.2%, so very, very close to the request. Those effective dates of the orders are June 1st to 21. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the order date is July 14th, but it's just that a purchaser looking and completing his due diligence and looking at the applications that were made would certainly be seeking, assurances from the vendor that these requests for the increases were justified and would include that in our financial modeling. So just to again reiterate, our for this same property, our capitalization rate that's indicated is 5.42%. And again, that's repeated on the same valuation showing that is repeated on page 8. The RTB order is on pages starting at page 9, which is virtually a blank page, but then through to page 12, along with a copy of the final orders that shows the increases located at pages 13 to 14. If I could then go briefly to page 23. And this was my reference earlier, and Ms. Darkanova was very forthright in her answer. I'd asked her, if you recall, the departments provided the transaction in December of 2020, which is all well and good as far as it goes, but there was another transaction in March of 23, which ultimately ended up in a sale price of $2,176,000, down considerably from the $2.4 million in 2020. We've used that March 23 a transaction in our capitalization rate analysis. Next, then on that same page, 2390 of McPhillips, this is where we're suggesting that the rents that were in place were well below market, and we've applied a CMHC, some CMHC data relating to the newer properties in our analysis, and that results in a cap rate, indicated cap rate of 5.59%. 700 St. Mary's Road. I recall, Madam Chair, that I'd asked Ms. Darkanova if she was aware of the municipal board order relating to transactions involving apartment buildings that were to be substantially renovated, and the impact that that has on financial modeling, and therefore the validity of the cap rate that would be otherwise indicated, and what the board said. And a copy of the board order is attached, but essentially what the board order said, if there are substantial renovations that are being done, the board agreed that those would be very suspect and likely would not be used for capitalization rates, because on the face of it, if one is assuming that the renovations are going to be completed and that the income levels are going to be substantially higher within a very reasonable time horizon, that then in turn leads to very skewed results if one just applies the historical revenue that's at a much lower price point. So for 700 St. Mary's, we've got a copy of a letter on page 24 that talks about the intent for such renovations, and would ask the board to take that into account when considering the capitalization rate for that property. Page 25, then 32 Arden. There was, and this is again information we found relating to the advertising after purchase. The property was in fact renovated, indicating the intention when purchasing, and there was also, we also indicate that it's an older sale, having transacted in 2019. Finally, then on page 29, that's the municipal board order, Madam Chair, that I was speaking to, and the reference, Mr. DuPont, my colleague, there's some highlighted portions on page 32 of our rebuttal. It's page 4 of the board order, where Mr. DuPont raises the concern with respect to the impact on cap rates where you do have intentions to renovate. And then ultimately on page 34 of the rebuttal, which is page 6 of the order, the board indicates that what they do say, there's two things they say. The board does not accept that any intention to renovate should disqualify it, and certainly don't disagree with that. But if it's a substantial renovation and a significant financial investment, then that is a factor, and the capitalization or the assumptions become so very different and so very skewed that it would not be appropriate to include that transaction in a cap rate analysis. So that was the board's comments in that case. Madam Chair, those are my comments with respect to the rebuttal. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Assessor, questions on the rebuttal?
No questions, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Stephenson?
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Arnell?
No questions, thanks.
Thank you. I have no questions either. So Ms. Idarhanova, you also have or you also
A
have
rebuttal, yeah.
Okay, give us a minute to get there.
Sounds good.
Mr. Reimer, you have it?
I do indeed, yes, thank you.
Thank you. Everybody else have it?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Go ahead, Ms. Assessor.
Okay, so for the city's rebuttal, I guess what would be page 12 of All Justice Cap Rate Study, there's a table with the sales for 345 Talbot, 677 Maryland, 738 St. Mary's, 100 Maryland, and 2390 McPhillips. And for sales 1 to 3, in our opinion, 1 year of income and expense information is insufficient to calculate a stabilized net operating income and unusable. For sale number 4, no actual income and expenses involved in the calculation of net operating income. So in our opinion, that one would also be unusable. For sale number 5, the potential gross income utilized by Altus is not based on historically reported information. So in our opinion, it's incorrectly stabilized. And then continuing to the page 2 of our rebuttal, it just goes, I guess, in more detail for the sales. So for 345 Talbot Avenue, we can see here that there's 1 year of income and expense information, and in our opinion, it's insufficient information for determining a cap rate. And a note would be that Altus's calculation average rent levels are inconsistent with rents reported in the prior year. And then if we go to page 3, we can see the financial for that. Going to page 4, for 677 Maryland Street. Again, there's 1 year of income and expense information. In our opinion, this is insufficient information for determining a cap rate. Again, the average rent levels are inconsistent with rents reported in prior year. Can see that on the page 5. Going to page 6 for 738 St. Mary's Road. There's again 1 year of income and expense information. And yeah, in our opinion, that's insufficient for determining a cap rate. And again, Alta's calculation of average rent levels are inconsistent with rent reported in prior years. And we can see the financial on page 7 for that one. And on page 8. And then for 100 Maryland Street, there doesn't seem to be any actual data. Page 10, 2390 McPhillips Street. Alta's calculation of average rent levels are inconsistent with rents reported in the prior year. And on page 11 is just an example of how we've stabilized 2390 McPhillips Street, since that's one that we've also used in our cap table that's presented in our briefs. And here we can see that the city uses 3 years of stabilized income and expense information to found the cap rate. Any questions?
Thank you very much. Mr. Reimer.
May I have a minute just to look at this? I don't, I won't have questions. I'd like the opportunity to summarize, because a couple of
Okay.
things that Ms. Darkanova has mentioned, I'd like to comment on that. But as far as specific questions on the rebuttal, no.
No questions. Thank you.
No.
Mr. Arnell.
No question at this time, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Stephenson.
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. And I have no questions. So, Ms. Assessor, would you like the opportunity for a summary?
No, I think it's, I guess, pretty clear that the city likes using 3 years of stabilized income and expense information.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Reimer.
A couple of comments, and I'll jump just briefly to Ms. Darkanova's rebuttal. Recall, Madam Chair, and this was the very point that I've been sort of stressing. The entire exercise relating to the income approach fundamentally is the principle of anticipation. What do you think you're going to be able to do with the property on a go forward? Historical information, 100%. Do you look at it 100% and you try and establish how it's been performing and how your assumptions when you're modeling what you think is going to happen with the property, how that might differ from historical performance and why. So in a couple of the cases of the department's rebuttal, and I recall Mr. Darkanova's comments that what we're doing in our analysis is different than what the historical information was submitted. 100%. Absolutely. That's exactly right. I take no issue factually, which is why I didn't have questions on it. But our very point is that when you've got a situation that where either the rents appear to be very below market, or you've got a situation where some of the assumptions you can demonstrate that some of the assumptions a prudent investor would make on a go forward would differ from what's happened in the past. That's exactly what investors are doing when they're applying the principle of anticipation and looking to see what they can do with the property. And again, I understand the department's applied the historical information to the best of their ability, but having said that, we are taking a look at what we believe an investor would have assumed on a go forward. McPhillips is a good example with the very low market rents relative to some market information, and that's why, notwithstanding that we didn't have some of that historical information in the case of McPhillips, we believe we're being very fair in our analysis. With respect to the comment that these transactions would be unusable because there's only 1 year, I don't accept that notion. It's not ideal to have just 1 year, but having said that, neither is it irrelevant and become unusable just for that very fact. I note that if you look at some of the transactions where we've got the 1 year's worth of data, the expense ratios appear to be very consistent with what you're going to see with the properties this afternoon. Again, the income will be based on very specific information we had as of that year. So certainly, it's not a case where it becomes unusable just for that fact. And certainly when the data in the cap rate derivation using the 1 year appears to be consistent with the assessments, expense ratios, and the application and the approach by Altus and the department, I suggest that's still very cogent evidence. I have concerns, as I mentioned, with the very low cap rates relative to the March 23 GIC rates at 4.5%. I'd ask the board to consider that. Ask the board to consider the fact that many of the cap rate in that cap rate summary the department provided were very far below even the 20th percentile on the original assessment chart that the assessment department has provided. So ask the board to place the appropriate weight on our study, and we're trying to be transparent with how we've applied the income approach, how we've applied the cap rate derivations, and ask the board to order accordingly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Reimer. Okay, that concludes item number 1. And so we've gone over things in a lot of detail, the cap rate study and your rebuttal evidence. Now, just a point of clarification, Mr. Reimer, does your rebuttal evidence apply through the whole docket?
Indeed, yes. Yeah.
Okay, and Ms. Assessor, same for you?
Yes.
Yes, okay, so we've got that clarified. So we don't need to go through it in great detail unless there is something at some point you'd like to raise that you didn't already raise, then feel free. But that took us a while, so let's move on with our docket to item number 2, which is file number 24-1294, 660 Edmonton Street. And again, this is an appeal of the assessment value, Ms. Assessor?
Correct.
Okay.
So for file number 24-1294, roll number is 1209-266-8100. Address is 60 Edmonton Street. The owner is Asteroid Investments Limited. Roll year here 2025 with a reference date of April 1st, 2023. The assessed value is $1,901,000. Classification is residential 2 and liability is taxable. This is an apartment with 1 building on site and 2 stories. The actual year built and effective year built are both 1959, and the number of suites here is 22 with 11 outdoor parking. Continuing to page 3, we have our income value summary. So we can see the suite breakdown. So there's 10 one-bedrooms and 12 two-bedrooms, totaling 22 units, and the average monthly rent per unit is $925.91. Gross potential rent is $244,440. Vacancy rate is model derived 4.3. Effective gross income at $233,929. The expense rate at 58.55%. Net operating income here, 96,964 with a capitalization rate of 5.10%, which leads to our estimated market value of 1,901,000 rounded. And the market value per suite here is $86,409.09. Going to page 4. My screen just froze a little bit, so it's not. Ooh, need to find it. Okay, so page 4. We see the subject as well as comparables 1 throughout 4. All our apartments. The effective year built ranges from 1950 to 1959. And we can see that the total number of units, it has an overall subjects at 22, comparable ones at 33, twos 22, 3 23, 4 34, and that the breakdown is going for, I guess, comparable 1 has 12 one-bedrooms, 21 two-bedrooms. Comparable 2 has 6 bachelors, 7 one-bedrooms, and 9 two-bedrooms. Comparable 3 has 6 one-bedrooms, 17 two-bedrooms. Comparable 4 has 12 one-bedrooms, 22 two-bedrooms. And that the gross floor area per unit ranges from 830 square feet to 1,071 square feet. The average monthly rent per unit ranges from 844 to 966. Going to page 5 is the capitalization rate evidence that was previously presented. I don't know, should I present this as well?
No, I don't think so. You went through it in some detail before, so just noting it is important, but I don't think you need to go through it in detail.
Okay, sounds good. I'll do that going forward.
Yeah.
And then on page 6, again, capitalization rate evidence. Going to page 8, we can see an aerial view of the subject property, as well as highlighting the location, the surrounding location, which is, in my opinion, a good location. On page 9, there's a Google Street View image from June 2022. On page 10, online information about 60 Edmonton. So it's located in the Broadway Assiniboine downtown neighborhood near the Legislative Building, the Forks, and Osborne Village, close to shops and restaurants. Upgrade a beautiful wood-style kitchen, cabinets with ceramic tile backsplash, refined hardwood floors throughout, new windows installed throughout the unit, some parking available, storage lockers, secure bicycle storage available, rent includes heat and water, affordable rent. Continuing to page 11, we can see the kitchen and the bathroom in the images. Page 12, more images of the subject. Going to 13, the 2022 mailer. And the 2022 mailer here generates an NOI of $116,246.37, which is in line with our model. Thank you. I'm open for questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Reimer, questions?
The only question I have, Madam Chair, Ms. Starkanova, just briefly on your page 3. So just to confirm, this was a value that was derived from top to bottom and right through cap rate is a model-driven value, correct?
Correct.
Thanks, Madam Chair. That's my only question at this time.
Thank you very much. Mr. Stephenson, questions for the assessor?
No questions at this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Arnell?
No questions, thanks.
Thank you. I have no questions either. So thank you for that. Mr. Reimer?
Thanks, Madam Chair. And from here on in, what I propose to do is be very concise. in my comments. So if I could ask the board members and Ms. Darkanova again to turn to our evidence in chief on page 16. Recall,
ahead.
Madam Chair, my single question of Ms. Darkanova was how the value is calculated, which is model driven. So as you see on page 16, you can see on line 13, our effective gross income is actually, we're very, very close. We've got a 231,377. The department's model driven is 233,929. Pardon me. We do have a slight variation on expenses on line 31. Our expenses are at 140,742 relative to the model driven expenses of 136,965. Again, there's not substantial variances, but it does result in a slightly lower NOI calculation on our part of 90,635 relative to the model driven NOI of 96,964. The request this afternoon would be to apply the stabilized NOI as shown there on page 16. But again, knowing that there isn't a whole lot to choose from as between the departments at 96 or call it 97,000 and ours at 90,635. The fundamental difference for the reasons we talked about earlier is cap rate. In this case, we're applying a rate of 5.75%. And the only additional reference I'll make, Madam Chair, if you go back 2 pages to page 14. So recall that both the original age and effective age of the subject is 1959. The bracket that I'm applying in this case is in the small chart towards the top of page 14. Our bracket of 1946 to 69 is 5.75 to 6.5. I've selected 5.75 at the lower end, or actually very lowest end of that range for the purpose of this valuation. And that is the rate that I'm using then to request that the assessment rate be reduced to 1,576,000. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reimer. Ms. Assessor, questions for Mr. Reimer?
No questions, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Arnell?
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Stephenson?
No questions, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I have no questions either. So that will conclude item number 2. Item 3, file number 24-2205, 43 Edmonton Street. And again, this is an appeal of the assessment value. Ms.
Correct.
Assessor? Okay, go ahead.
File number 24-2205, roll number 12092647000. Address is 43 Edmonton Street. The owner is 602-3487 Manitoba Limited. The roll year is 2025 with a reference date of April 1st, 2023. The assessed value is 1,876,000. Classification is residential 2 and the liability is taxable. This is an apartment building with one building on site, and that building is 2 stories. The actual year built is 1959, and the effective year built here is 1975. There are 18 suites and 4 outdoor parking. Continuing to page 3. For our income value summary, the breakdown for units has 12 bachelors and 6 one-bedroom. The average monthly rent per unit is $821.52, and this is the model-derived valuation below. The gross potential rent is $177,448 with the vacancy rate 4.3%. The effective gross income, $169,818. The expense rate at 48.63%. Net operating income, $87,236 with a capitalization rate, 4.65%. This leads us to our rounded estimated market value at $1,876,000. The market value per suite is $104,222.22. Going to page 4, we can see our subject and comparables. So all comparables are apartment, and they all have 2 stories, 1 building. The range for the comparables effective year built are 1969 to 1980. There's a similar suite mix, it seems, throughout. Comparable 3 has only bachelor units. The gross floor area per unit ranges from 512 square feet to 802 square feet, and the average monthly rent per unit ranges from 761 to $952. On page 5, we have capitalization rate evidence, as well as on page 6. Page 7 is our Municipal Assessment Act excerpts. Page 8 shows the aerial view for the subject property, as well as below that, the subject property with its surrounding location. It's in a good location. On page 9, we have our Google Street View image from June 2022, and on page 10, some online information for the subject property. So just highlighting that the apartment living in Winnipeg has never been so easy. The subject's within walking distance to Bonnycastle Dog Park, Legislative Building, the Forks Market, close to major bus routes, highlights bike riding. The bachelor suites feature modern kitchen and bathroom, full-size stainless steel appliances, and plenty of kitchen storage space. It seems to be marketed to students and professionals alike. Going to page 11, we can start seeing images of the apartment. Seems that it was even renovated past 1975, potentially. I have not inspected this. And then on page 14, we have the 2022 mailer. So the net operating income here is $1,324.33, and this is in line with our model NOI as well, which is back on page 3, I believe, and is at 87,236. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I'm open for questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Reimer, questions for the assessor?
Thanks, Madam Chair. Mr. Darkanova, so this is again a value that's derived from top to bottom, including cap rate by model-driven values, correct?
Correct.
That's my question. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. Arnell, questions?
No questions, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Stephenson?
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. I have a couple questions. This one has an effective age of 1975, so it was inspected at some point.
At some
Can you
point,
tell
yes.
me, can you tell me when it was inspected?
Let me take a quick look. If I can find that out for you. Hopefully I can.
Mhm.
It seems to have been, just want to make sure that I'm giving you the right information. 1 second. There was a complete inspection in 2013. Yeah. So 2013 would be when that effective age was applied, it seems.
Okay, so your cap rate in this instance would reflect that updated
Of
information.
1975, yes.
Yeah, 10 years old, but updated from 1959, obviously, right?
Correct.
Okay. I should have asked this on the other properties, but the same situation applies here about parking. I've noted that there's much fewer parking stalls than there is available with the properties. So does that mean parking is rented out from other buildings, or is there no parking, or what's the situation on this one?
On this one, I would think that they have the 4 outdoor, and looking at their financials quickly just to see if they are getting anything for parking. I don't think they're listing. Oh, they are, I guess, profiting off of those 4 stalls. And I
mhm.
think generally in this area and for this age of apartments, we don't always see an equal 1-to-1 ratio for parking. And I would assume that many of the tenants here may either street park if they have a vehicle or rely on bus routes.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Reimer.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Again, to cut to the heart of the matter, if we could turn to our page 16, please. So this is another case where the NOI were actually just a touch higher than the model-driven NOI by the department, about 2,000, call it, dollars higher. So clearly that's not an issue. And the capitalization rate, Madam Chair, I can tell you that what I've done in this submission is I've accepted the effective age of 1975 rather than the original of 1959. And our cap rate request, pardon me, is 5.5%. Just briefly turning back to page 14, the bracket using that effective age, the bracket that according to our capitalization rate analysis, this would fall into is the 1970 to 1989 category. And I've again used a cap rate of 5.5% at the very lowest end of the range. So based upon the submissions as to cap rate, and again, assuming the effective age of 1975 and the cap rate of 5.5%, based on that bracketing at the low end of the range, we request a reduction to 1,626,000. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Assessor, questions for the applicant?
No questions, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Stephenson,
No questions, thank you.
Mr. Arnell?
No questions, thanks.
Okay, I have no questions either. So any summation, Ms. Assessor?
No thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Reimer?
No, thank you.
Okay. We're a third of the way through our agenda. Does anybody wish a five or so minute break before we continue on? Or we could do one more and then have a break. What is everyone's desire?
I'm good. Let's keep going.
Anybody
If
else?
we could just have that break quickly, that would be much appreciated.
Okay. Okay. Let's it's 2:23, 2:24 now. Is 6 minutes okay? Resume at 2:30?
Sounds good.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. I'd like to call our meeting back to order. We're now resuming our meeting with item number 4, 24-2571. Property address 87 Smith Street. This is an appeal of the assessed value. Is that correct, Ms. Adarhanova?
Correct.
Thank you. You may begin then.
File number 24-2571. Roll number is 1209250000. Address is 87 Smith Street. Owner is Midland Commercial Sales and Service Limited. Roll year is 2025 with the reference date being April 1st, 2023. The assessed value is 1,932,000 and we have a rec on that one. Classification is residential 2 and liability is taxable. So this is an apartment with 1 building on site and 3 stories. The actual year built and effective year built is 1930. There is 39 suites and 1 outdoor parking. So the recommendation is to reduce the assessment to $1,762,000 to better reflect market value. See page 10 for calculations. So that's the next page that we'll be going to.
Okay, perhaps before you go on to that, I will ask Mr. Reimer if he accepts that recommendation to reduce the value to $1,762,000.
Appreciate the recommendation, Madam Chair. I think we're still a little bit different in our values. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Ms. Edorhanova.
So on page 10, we have the EGI as was reported in actuals, and we've adjusted to the 2022 for the EGI being 221,879, and then we've used the 5% management, and we've maintained the model expense ratio at 59.5%, which leads us to our new net operating income at 89,861, with maintaining the same capitalization rate at 5.1%. And then this brings us to our rounded 1,762,000. And now we'll just, I guess, go find our comparable table. We'll go to page 3 quickly just to touch on the unit breakdown. So we have 38 bachelors and one bedroom in this apartment. And for our comparables on page 4, all our apartments all have 3 stories, and the comparables effective year built ranges from 1929 to 1944. And here they all seem to have a pretty high bachelor to one bedroom ratio. And the gross floor area per unit ranges from 565 to 670 square feet. Comparables are larger than subject in that sense, and the average monthly rent per unit ranges from $640 to $736 for the comparables. Page 5 and 6, we have our capitalization rate evidence. Page 7, Municipal Assessment Act excerpts. Page 8 shows subject property and aerial view, and as well just highlighting the good location and close proximity to the Forks, Canada Life Center, RBC Convention Center. Going to page 9, we can see the exterior Google Street View image, May 2019. Then we've taken a look at page 10 already, and then on pages 11 through 14, we have the mailer information. So in year 2022, we've taken the total income for our recommendation. And that would conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Reimer, questions?
Thanks, Madam Chair. Mr. Darnova, just going to your page 10 very briefly. Recall my earlier questions typically was that it was model driven from top to bottom, but actually in this case, then if I understand right, what you've done is you brought the effective gross income down a little bit with reference to the actual performance of the property.
That's correct. We felt that the model was too high.
Okay, and then with the expense ratio, we've both actually, I noticed this, we both adjusted the management fees. So that adjustment you show on page 10, at the end of the day, you've applied the same expense ratio of 59.5%, but then applied it to the lower EGI, and that would incorporate the change or the adjustment, I should say, to the management fee, correct? With the expenses specifically?
Correct. Yeah, we used the 59.5. That was our model
Okay.
rate.
And the cap rate is model driven.
Yep.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Those are my questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Stephenson, questions?
No questions at this time, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Arnell?
No questions, thanks.
Okay, I'm trying to understand your page 10 as well.
Okay.
So I see what you have done. You've applied your model. I'm looking at the expense rate specifically. So I see that you have applied your 59.5% model. But actual expenses are showing higher. So my question is, you've adjusted the income side to reflect actual, but you didn't look at the expenses to reflect actual? Like, I'm just curious as to why you didn't. Or
Yeah, so we felt that it was reasonable to continue with the modeled expense rate, as that's typically what's seen in the area, but we did take into account that the EGI that the model had before was just too high for this property. And I think even looking in the blue here, we can see some fluctuation. So on typically it is higher for the subject itself to be operating in terms of expenses, but we can see that the maintenance and repair in 2022 is higher than that in maintenance in the 2021 and 2020 year. And just numbers like that are fluctuating that could, in a sense, balance out in some way so that it's not too far off from what the model was saying at 59.5%, if that makes sense.
but we're seeing 71%, which is in 2022, which, as you point out, is quite high. And that would be the maintenance and repair, right? Predominantly
For that one, it seems that way. There's also, I guess, HVAC is higher, but
oh yeah, HVAC too, yeah. So you think there might be some sort of capital expenditure in there?
I'm not too sure. I didn't see any permits for this one. And let me just look through if the vacancies, the vacancies seems to be normal in the 2022 mailer.
Yeah, and the vacancy would have been captured in your stabilized, right? Oh, I see. Reflecting on your R&M, right? Yeah, or cap.
Yeah, so I'm not sure.
Okay.
I just didn't think it was unreasonable to continue with the model expense rate at 59.5%, just in terms of what else information we've gathered for that area.
Okay, and the 1930 building, would that typically have a higher expense ratio than others?
I think it would, as it's not as new, but in terms of that area and just what's, the age group within that area to begin with, I kind of think that's may already be factored in.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Reimer.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Could I ask the board members and Ms. Darkanova to turn to page 15, please? So appreciate, if you recall, Madam Chair, the recommendation is based on an adjustment to the effective gross income, and we're now very, very close, in fact. So for all intents and purposes, the remaining discussion and debate relating to the difference in NOI, does have to do with the expenses. And Madam Chair, your questions were things I was going to point out in our analysis on page 15. This is a 1930 building, and so one would expect two significant expense items that would be higher than some other buildings, obviously, that aren't as old. One of them being utilities, and that is reflected on our line 23, the expense line. We've used the 2022 utilities of 46,200. That is a significant increase, but certainly Typically, the utility costs, they may fluctuate a little, but all of the things being equal, they will tend to rise just with the increases in gas rates and electricity rates and such. So we've used the 46,201. And as far as the R&M, you can see on our line 27, there was a low we've used the 3-year average. The lowest was in 2021 at 38,375. The highest was in 2022 at 50,274. We've applied the 3-year average as a stabilized amount, which we believe is being very fair and reasonable. I do note that I won't go through it, but the questionnaire sent in by the owner to the department indicates that the entire amount of 50,274 is classified as R&M and not. If you recall, the questionnaire has a separate section to indicate capital items, and there was no capital items indicated. It was all shown as R&M. But having said that, certainly the 3-year average, I'd suggest, stands to reason at the 42,825. So at the end of the day, what results from that is our NOI calculation at line 33 is 70,215, which is still pretty significantly lower than the department's calculation based on Mr. Darkanova's revised valuation on page 10. Their NOI was 89,000, ours is 70,000. And the significant difference now relates to the expenses. And I would ask the board to consider the stabilized expenses as shown by us on page 15. And for the reasons mentioned previously, we're applying a cap rate here of 6.1% based on the 1930 age, resulting in the request at 1,151,000. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Assessor, questions?
Just trying to flip back to page 15 to see. It's a little slow on my end, sorry. I don't think I have any questions at the moment. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Mr. Stephenson.
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Arnell.
Just clarification. So you just averaged out your 3 years of expenses?
No, not all of them. The RNet, the repairs and maintenance, is based on the 3-year average.
Okay.
The management fee, we've also, as Ms. Darkanova had also done, we've adjusted it downwards to reflect the 5% standard. And the other significant item among the others is the utilities, where we've applied the 2022 actuals at 46,201. But the R&M was the 3-year average, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. And I have no questions either. So that will conclude summation, Ms. Assessor,
I'm good, thanks.
Mr. Reimer.
No, thank you.
That now concludes item 4. Okay, let's move on to item number 5, file number 24-1321. This is 165 Kennedy Street. Ms. Assessor, this is an appeal of value, correct?
Correct.
Okay, you may
So
begin.
file number 24-1321. Roll number is 1209364710. Address is 165 Kennedy Street. The owner is Grant Spink Limited. Roll year is 2025 with the reference date April 1st, 2023. The assessed value is 1,669,000. Classification is residential 2. Liability is taxable. This is an apartment with 1 building on site and 3 stories. The actual year built and effective year built here is 1912. Number of suites here is 23 with 1 outdoor parking. Continuing to page 3, we can see that there's 1 1-bedroom and 21 2-bedrooms. The average monthly rent per unit is $800.65. The gross potential rent is $220,979. Vacancy rate is 4.3%. The effective gross income is $211,477. The expense rate here is 58.95%. And the net operating income is $86,811. Capitalization rate of 5.2. Estimated market value is $1,669,000. And this is all model derived. The market value per suite is $72,565.22. And going to page 4, we have the rent comparables. So all our apartments all have 3 stories, and the effective year built ranges amongst comparables from 1911 to 1927. Here we can see in the suite mix that comparable 1 is predominantly 2 bedrooms, as well as comparable 2, comparable 3 and 4 are more so balanced, being 1 bedroom and 2 bedroom. The gross floor area per unit ranges from 702 square feet to 1,117 square feet amongst the comparables. The subjects a little bit bigger than that high range. The average monthly rent here ranges from $720 to $903. On page 5 and 6, we have our capitalization rate evidence. And then on page 7, the Municipal Assessment Act excerpts. And on page 8, we can see the aerial view for the subject, as well as subject in general location. Again, similar location to the previous apartments we've seen. It's pretty good. On page 9, we have our Google Street View image of the exterior. Then on page 10, we have the online photos for the subject. So it seems here that it's modernized. Just looking at the images. Page 11, living room and kitchen. Page 12 seems more of a, I guess, unmodernized bathroom. And on page 13, we have our 2022 mailer with the multifamily information. Have a 7% vacancy here. And we can see that in 2022, the profit loss was $64,516. And going on page, and that's on page 16, sorry. And then on page 15, it seems that the natural gas is higher, being near 41,000 versus what we'll see, I think, in the previous mailer below. So going now on page 17 to our 2020 mailer, you can see that the gross potential suite income at 100% occupancy here is at 248,424. There's a more typical vacancy at 3.2%. And the natural gas, instead of being near 41,000, I believe it's at 21,402. So there seems to be some, I guess, discrepancies. And in my opinion, I think 2020 is what is more reasonably expected for this building. And here we can see the profit loss at $95,687.72, which is higher than what our model has at 86,811. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I'm open for questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Reimer, questions?
Yes, thank you. So just again, at the end of the day, Mr. Darkanova, I think our overall NOI calculations come in reasonably close, but you've mentioned the gas expense, the utility expense, and it's certainly something that we can agree that that's something that does fluctuate from year to year.
That's true. And I'm just looking also at the vacancy
Certainly,
that's reported in the 2022 Miller.
right. So, and with respect to the, you'd mentioned, I believe the NOI in 2020 was 95,000, but we could also agree the reported NOI for 21 and 22 was much closer to 70,000, correct?
I can't remember the 21 info, and that's not in my brief, but for in terms of like 2020 versus 2022, yes.
Okay, that's fine. I've got the 21 information. So, and again, the capitalization rate, well, the entire valuation on page 3, including cap rate and the expenses, it's all model driven, correct?
Model driven, correct.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Those are my questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Arnell, questions for the assessor?
No questions at this time, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Stephenson?
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. I have no questions either. So thank you for your presentation. And we will move to Mr. Reimer.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Page 15, please. So you'll see on page 15, and I mentioned earlier that at the end of the day, our NOI calculations come in within roughly 10% of each other. We are still lower at 79,260 as shown there. The effective gross income is actually a case, in this case, again, where we're higher. We've got an EGI of 222,000. The department's got 211,000. So the difference in the final NOI calculation does come down to expenses. We've applied a stabilized expense ratio, stabilized expenses of 143,113. That is based on the application of the higher gas expense of 40,000. It's also based on a 3-year average of the R&M. And so at the end of the day, the expenses that we've applied are considerably higher, but the EGI we've applied is also higher. So we are still coming in at 79,260. And the request this afternoon is to apply that slightly lower NOI along with a cap rate of 6.1%. The cap rate, of course, is also based on the age bracket that, and I'll just refer to it briefly, the board and Mr. Canova don't need to turn there, but it's based on the pre-1946 age bracket and using the lowest indicated cap for that bracket at 6.1%. That's what we applied here. And so we asked the board to order accordingly for this building that was constructed in 1912. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Adarhanova, questions for Mr. Reimer?
No questions, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Stephenson?
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Arnell?
No questions, thanks.
Thank you. I have a question just related to that hydro expense, the gas expense.
Gas expense, yeah.
Did you speak to your client and find out why it's higher?
I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. And when Ms. I keep pronouncing the K, Adarhanova, mentioned it, it does seem off. Admittedly, it seems awfully high. There was an increase of $5,000 between 20 and 21, and then an increase of 14 between 21 and 22. So it's not like repairs and maintenance where one would expect where there'd be significant fluctuations, and depending on what's going on, the calculation or the accounting for the gas expense should be very straightforward. So, Madam Chair, I can't. It does seem like quite a big increase, and but having said that, it would be directly taken from a very clear record of what was actually paid in that year.
Okay. Can you make any assumptions as to what would do that?
Very cold weather.
Yeah, except last year wasn't. I guess it's
2020,
2022, so
Yes,
maybe
yeah.
I'm thinking
Yeah, no,
2023.
last winter was not. I do
Yeah.
remember last winter. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. No, it was just a curiosity there for me.
Yeah.
And the vacancy is higher.
It is.
And do you have an explanation for that?
Other than what we've applied is the 3-year average, but beyond
Okay.
that, it was actually 7.5 in 22, slightly higher in 21, and then lower in 20. So we've applied the 3-year average.
Okay. Okay. Sorry, just writing that down. Okay, I have no additional questions. Ms. Darhanova, questions for, or summation, sorry.
No thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Reimer,
No, thank you.
thank you. And so that will include, that will conclude item number 5 on our agenda. Let's move on to item number 6 on our agenda. Ms. Darhanova, you may begin, please.
File number 24-1437. Roll number is 120978066720. Address is 205 Arlington Street, and the owner is Montreux Holdings Inc., Barry W. Riley. And here the roll year is 2025 with the reference date April 1st, 2023. The assessed value is $1,712,000. Classification is residential 2, and the liability is taxable. I believe for this one, just took a peek at the applicant's brief. I believe they're looking for a confirmation.
Okay, so why don't you just read in the highlights and then we'll go to Mr. Reimer.
Okay.
Sorry, is this 205 Arlington?
No. 753 Wolseley.
Oh,
Oh.
I must have been reading the wrong one. Sorry.
I was also on Arlington, so we're on Wolseley.
Yep, we're on Wolseley.
Wolseley, okay. So file number 24-2207. Roll number 120900390000. Address is 753 Wolseley Avenue, and the owner is 7041978 Manitoba Limited. Roll year 2025 with the reference date of April 1st, 2023. The assessed value is $1,603,000. The classification is residential 2, and the liability is taxable. This is an apartment with 1 building, 3 stories. The actual year built and effective year built is 1912. And going to page 3, has 21 bedrooms. And I believe this is the confirmation, so I'll just give the highlights. So we have the gross potential rent at $184,099. Vacancy rate 3.6%. Effective gross income $177,471. Vacant expense rate 52.59%. Net operating income is $84,139. Capitalization rate here is 5.25%. And the estimated market value rounded is $1,603,000, and the market value per suite is $80,150. Comparable 4, page 4. I have the rent comparables, and we can take a look at that. I think on page 5 and 6, and that would be cap rate evidence, page 7, Municipal Assessment Act, and then pages 8, 9 show the interior of the units. And then we have the 2022 mailer on page 10 going through 11. And on page 12, we have a permit for interior and exterior alteration apartments. So, and that permit value is $1,500,000. That would conclude my presentation.
Thank you. Mr. Reimer,
No questions.
thank you very much. Mr. Arnell,
No questions, thanks.
thank you. Mr. Stephenson,
No questions, thank you.
And no questions from me either. So, Mr. Reimer,
I would request that the board confirm the present assessment under 54.1 of the Act at this time. Thank you.
thank you very much. Ms. Edarhanova, questions, comments on Mr. Reimer's request?
No thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Stephenson? Mr. Arnell?
No, no question.
Okay, thank you. That will conclude item number 7, or item number 6. Sorry about that. So let's move to item number 7. This is file number 24-1437, 205 Arlington. Ms. Edarhanova, this is an appeal of assessment value.
Correct.
Okay, you may begin, please.
File number 24-1437, roll number 12097806720. The address is 205 Arlington Street. Owner is Montreux Holdings Inc., Barry W. Riley. Roll year is 2025 with a reference date of April 1st, 2023. The assessed value is $1,712,000. Classification is residential 2 and the liability is taxable. This is an apartment. There are 2 buildings on site and 3 stories. The effective year built and actual year built is 1929. And we have 16 suites with 4 indoor parking. Continuing to page 3, we can see the suite breakdown. So we have 5 1-bedrooms, 6 2-bedrooms, 5 3-bedrooms, totaling to 16 units. And the average monthly rent per unit is $1,033.50. And we can see that the gross potential rent, all of which is model derived on this page, is $198,432 with a vacancy rate at 3.6%. The effective gross income is $191,288 and the expense rate is 52.11%. The net operating income here is $91,608 and the capitalization rate is 5.35%, giving us our estimated market value of $1,712,000 rounded, and the market value per suite here is $107,000. On page 4, we have the comparables, so all of which are apartments and seem to be 3 stories. The comparables have 1 building on site and they range from effective year built being 1909 to 1928. We have total number of units being 15 and 9 for comparables. And the gross floor area per unit ranges from 1,053 to 1,211. So that makes our subject on the larger end of that scale. And the average monthly rent per unit is $964 to $1,480. Again, on page 5, the cap rate evidence, as well as on page 6, page 7, Municipal Assessment Act excerpts. And on page 8, we have the subject in an aerial view, as well as on a larger scale here within the Wolseley neighborhood. On page 9, there's an image of the subject from Google Street View, as well as some online information. So, spacious and quiet character apartments located in highly sought after Wolseley. This charming heritage building offers spacious suites with a time-honored Wolseley atmosphere, on-site laundry, on-site building management, outdoor parking, and controlled building access. Provide all the necessities needed to call Baldwin home. The neighborhood offers many attractions such as Shoppers, Drug Mart, Stell's Cafe, some more location highlights, as well as Willow Park Mall. And on page 10, we have our 2022 mailer with the financials on page 11. That would conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Reimer.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Mr. Artanova, it's again, a model-driven value from top to bottom, correct?
Correct.
And so specifically in this case, the expenses that the model derived, which is 99,680, that was without reference to the actual performance, correct?
It's all model driven.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Those are my questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Stephenson, questions?
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Arnell?
No questions, thanks.
Thank you. I just have a quick question here about the INE that you've provided. It's just the 2 pages?
Yeah, that's the information we had for that year.
Okay. So no breakdown of the actual vacancy or anything like that?
Not that's pre-listed. That would have to be calculated.
Okay. No, that's okay. And what is this reference up at the top? It says something, 2 properties treated as one entity.
I think that would be if we go to where I have the aerial
Okay.
screenshot, just trying to find that page myself. 1 second.
Page 8, I think.
Yes. So I think that when we see on the, I guess, the top of the subject, we see 860 Preston, and then on running along, I guess, let me just see. Arlington Street, that looks like 205 as the number
Okay.
over there.
Okay.
So it's all referring to the subject. I think it's just how they themselves make note of it is what I would think.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not quite understanding the building, but okay. I'll take your word for it. But regardless, this financial information applies just to our subject, despite the fact that,
Correct.
okay,
That's what it seems like with the 860 and 205 and just looking at the image
okay,
and the addresses displayed there.
okay. Thank you very much for that. Mr. Reimer.
Thanks, Madam Chair. On that point, yeah, it's so the building is kind of a, I guess, kind of a U shape, and for reasons that I don't fully understand, they are segmenting out the stuff that fronts on Preston versus Arlington, but it is all just the one building.
Okay.
Yeah. So, could I ask the board members and Ms. Adarnova to turn to page 16, please? So in this case, our EGI shown on line 13 is about $12,000 higher than the model driven EGI, but our expenses are considerably higher. If you go down to line 31, our expenses, stabilized expenses that we've applied in this case is just under 126,000. So that does, at the end of the day, when you balance out the slightly higher EGI and the higher expenses, our calculation of a stabilized NOI is 77,330. Very consistent with the 2022 operating results, which once you remove, you will notice in the income statement that it has been provided for the property. There's 2 items that are not allowable, the interest on long-term debt and the amortization. So once you pull those 2 items out, the indicated actual NOI in 2022 was 76,752. We're using 77,330 based on the stabilized expenses that's shown there. And for the reasons we've discussed previously, we're treating this as the pre-1946 bracket for the purposes of the capitalization. We've applied a capitalization rate of 6.1 and request a reduction to 1,268,000. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Edarhanova, questions for Mr. Reimer?
No questions, thanks.
Thank you very much. Mr. Arnell,
No questions, thanks.
thank you. Mr. Stephenson,
No questions, thank you.
thank you. Mr. Reimer, I see on your page 16 that you have stabilized that R&M to be the 2022. You
Yep.
didn't take the average given that very high R&M in 2020.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay.
We've actually applied, Madam Chair, the actual 22s in this case. Just there wasn't much difference between 21 and 22. So we've
Okay.
just applied the 2022, yeah, as being a more reasonable sort of stable R&M amount on a go forward.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. And just a question back for our assessor. Your expense is all model?
All model, correct.
Okay, thank you. Okay, that was all my questions for item number 7. Any desire for summation, Ms. Assessor?
No thanks.
Mr. Applicant?
No, thank you.
Thank you. Then that concludes item number 7. So let's move to item number 8. This is file number 24-2321, 203 Woodlawn Street. And this is an appeal of assessed value.
Correct.
Okay, then go ahead, please.
So file number 24-2321. Roll number is 070512410000. The address is 203 Woodlawn Street, and the owner is Takoko Rentals Limited. Roll year 2025 with a reference date of April 1st, 2023. The assessed value is $1,692,000. The classification is residential 2, and the liability is taxable. This is an apartment, and there is one building on site with 2 stories. The actual year built and effective year built are both 1961. There are 16 suites and 16 outdoor parking. And it seems that there is a subject sale history that's, of April 6, 2021 for $1,575,000. Continuing to page 3, we have 16 one-bedrooms, and the average monthly rent per unit is $858.38. And for our model-derived assessment, the gross potential rent is $164,809. We have a vacancy rate here of 2.6%. We have an effective gross income of $160,524 and an expense rate of 47.81%. The net operating income is $83,777, and the capitalization rate here is 4.95%. The estimated market value is $1,692,000, and the market value per suite is $105,750. On page 4, we have the rent comparable table. All are apartments and ranging between 2 and 3 stories. The effective year built for the comparables ranges from 1954 to 1974. Here we have a suite mix, predominantly 1 bedroom for the comparables, with comparables 1, 2, and 3 having bachelor units as well, and comparable 2 also having the 2 bedrooms. The gross floor area per unit ranges from 655 square feet to 836 square feet. The average monthly rent per unit here ranges from $810 to $977. On page 5 and 6, we have our cap rate evidence. And on page 7, the Municipal Assessment Act excerpts. Page 8, we have the aerial image of our subject property, and we can see that it's just off of Portage on Woodlawn. And I guess going back to the comparable tables, I believe all the comparables were on Portage. So location here, close proximity to Polo Park, the airport, Grace Hospital, Assiniboine Park. Good location. Page 9, a Google Street View images. And we can see the parking that it has as well. Page 10 would be our 2022 income and expense information. Continuing on to page 11. And we can see here that the net operating income is $89,412.46, which is in line with our model, which is at 83,777 for the NOI. That would conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Reimer?
Again, Ms. Darnova, it's entirely model driven from top to bottom, correct?
Correct.
Madam Chair, that's my only question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Stephenson, questions for the assessor?
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Arnell?
No questions, thanks.
Thank you. I have no questions either. Mr. Reimer then.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Page 15, please. This is another case, as you're getting to page 15, this is another case where our NOI, stabilized NOI, is actually higher than the model-driven NOI presented this afternoon. So the model-driven NOI, if you recall, was just a touch under 84,000. We're actually at 88,648. So this entire discussion and debate revolves around cap rate. We have applied in this case a capitalization rate of 5.75% based on the effective and actual year of 1961. The board members and Mr. Nova need not turn to it, but our bracketing is 1946 to 1969 with an indicated range of 5.75 to 6.5. That for reference is on our page 13. So I've applied the 5.75 at the very lowest end of that range in this case and request a reduction to 1,542,000. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Edarhanova, questions?
No questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Arnell?
No questions, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Stephenson?
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. And no questions from me either. So, Ms. Assessor, summation?
No thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Reimer?
No, thank you.
Thank you. That will conclude item 8. So now we are on our final item, item number 9, file number 24-1494532 Tilehurst. Ms. Edarhanova, this is an appeal of the assessment value, correct? Okay. All right, you may begin, please.
File number is 24-1494. Roll number is 12080016000. Address is 532 Tilehurst Street, and the owner is Rosen Corp Limited. The roll year is 2025, with the reference date being April 1st, 2023. The assessed value is $1,983,000. Classification residential 2. Liabilities taxable. This is an apartment, and there's one building on site, which is 2 stories. The actual and effective year built are both 1959, and we have 20 suites with 10 outdoor parking here. The subject has a sale in April 10th, 2018 for 1,500,000. On page 3, we can see that the suite breakdown here is 12 bachelor units and 8 one-bedroom units, which brings us to our 20 units. The average monthly rent per unit is $773.16. The gross potential rent is 185,558. The vacancy rate is 2.6%. The effective gross income is 180,733. The expense rate is 45.68%, and the net operating income here is 98,174. The capitalization rate is 4.95%, and the estimated market value is 1,983,000 rounded. The market value per suite is $99,150. And this is model derived. Continuing to page 4, we can see that all our apartments, they range between 2 and 3 stories. The effective year built here ranges from 1954 to 1974. And we have the units, total units for the comparables. So comparable 1 has breakdown of 7 bachelors, 6 one-bedroom, 7 two-bedroom. Comparable 2, 9 bachelors, 15 one-bedrooms. Comparable 3, 6 bachelors, 11 one-bedroom. And comparable 4, 9 bachelors, 17 bedrooms, and 4 two-bedrooms. The gross floor area per unit here ranges from 655 square feet to 836 square feet, with the subject being on the lower end of that range. And the average monthly rent per unit is $901 to $941. The subject is also on the lower end for that one as well. Page 5 and 6 would be the capitalization rate evidence. Page 7, the Municipal Assessment Act excerpts. Page 8 shows the subject location near Polo Park. Seems to be near Assiniboine Park, near Wolseley. And we can see here that it's not too far off from Portage, on the lower end of the picture on page 8. Page 9 is the exterior in the July 2017 Google Street View. And on page 10, we can see that the, I guess, financials for the apartment and the NOI here is 99,243.37, which is in line with what we had the model at, which was at $98,174. That would conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Reimer, questions for Ms. Idarhanova?
Thanks, Madam Chair. So again, this is model driven
Sorry.
top to bottom, correct?
Correct.
Thanks, Madam Chair. That's my only question.
Thank you very much. Mr. Arnell?
No questions, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Stephenson?
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. I just have a question about the sale. Is that sale arm's length sale? Did you check into it?
Let me just see if I can quickly pull that up now. I don't think I made any notes on it, but I do think that I took a peek into it. So I'll just quickly check again. The vendors don't seem to be related. So it does seem to be arm's length.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Reimer.
Thanks, Madam Chair. And just on that point, that's my understanding as well, just for the board's reference.
Okay,
Page
thank you.
15, please. So again, this is another case. We are within $1,000 in the NOI calculation, so that's just not under debate. I'll leave it to the board to consider our slightly lower NOI. It all comes down again to cap rate. We're suggesting a rate of 5.75% based on the evidence previously considered and submitted. And that is again based on the bracketing. And I'll just quickly allude to it. It's the bracket 1946 to 69, which has an indicated range of 5.75 to 6.5. And in this case, we've applied the 5.75. And therefore the request to reduce the assessment to $1,689,000. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Adarhanova, questions?
I don't have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Stephenson.
Just to comment on the utilities, I guess, for 2022, like any comments as to why they increased so much, and like you're using the 22 numbers. Like,
Yeah, it seems to be a common theme where, well, not common, I should say, but it's happened on a couple of occasions now where they jump a lot with some of these buildings. So the quick answer is I haven't asked the question, but I'm suggesting that certainly the actually in this case it's the water that jumped up a lot and the gas. Yeah, water and gas both. I don't know the answer to that, Madam Chair. They are significantly higher. Yeah. I mean, other than the fact that they're the utilities and it's very easy to account for, but as far as the increase, the substantial increases, I'm not aware of any other underlying reason for it.
Yeah, just looking at the stabilized NOI versus the stabilized NOI versus the average too, like you're almost 10,000 less.
Right, we've applied.
It's skewed by the utilities there a little bit. A couple of figures.
Yep. The utilities would be the utilities were significantly higher, so they were about 19,000 higher in 2022. So that would certainly have an impact. I mean, we're within $1,000 of the model-driven NOI, but yes, that would have an impact on the NOI calculation. Without question.
Great, thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Arnell.
No questions, thanks.
Thank you. And I have no questions either. So before we conclude, Ms. Adarhanova, summation on this property?
No, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Reimer?
No, thank you.
Okay, so with that, then we have heard all items on our agenda, and this hearing is now concluded. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you, and you
Bye-bye.
too.